All right. So I think we have all the dynamic speakers here already. So let's get this started. Uh, so a little bit of background. You know, I'll give a 30-second plug-in for how we started, and I think I cannot stop repeating this story of ours. When we started CFF, it was pretty much at a when Admiral Rogers was doing his first public speaking at the Baltimore National Hall of Fame, Cybersecurity Hall of Fame Award, and he was the inductee, and he gave his speech. Between him and Robert Rodriguez, my other very good friend and mentor, who is the chairman of CyNet, we had this conversation about how can we have a more, a clear expectation of cybersecurity in terms of the law and order, and we landed on Cyber Peace Initiative, and that's how we got started. It was not where the story ended, so we went and founded Cyber Future Foundation, and then kind of took it from there to have a more broader conversation. But I have been yearning to this day where we have cyber peace as a serious conversation in a mainstream cybersecurity conference or summit meeting. So I would quickly go around the speakers today and tell you this is a very diverse panel in terms of the background. We have Dr. Scott Shackelford, who is with the Kelley School of Business and is one of the very, very few and exceptional cyber peace experts. Next to him, we have Bob Seaman, our international representative, I would say, from Canada, has been a very active participant in this conversation, especially in the real order of peace that we talk about having the expectation of law and order and justice. And then we have Tony Spinelli. Tony is a dear friend, and more importantly, he's been in this whole conversation of taking it from the cybersecurity realm of having been a CISO at four different big organizations, and he understands the problem, taking it to the Congress and the Senate and working very actively on this. So I want to do a quick round of your background, and we have a short presentation. I think we have about 35 minutes. So we have a short presentation about what does this mean from a technical standpoint, what does realizing cyber peace mean, and then we will get into this conversation back again. So Scott, a brief presentation on any background, please. Because you are the real expert on this field.
Well, I don't know. Then we're all screwed. No, it's such it's such a pleasure, Val. It's an honor to be here with all of you. We'll try to keep this pretty high energy. It's after lunch, right? I get it. We can do some cyber hacky sacks talking about peace. As was mentioned, I'm a professor at Indiana University. I'll just kind of madly wave my finger to kind of go to the next slide occasionally. I wear a couple different hats there. One is I chair our cybersecurity program, which kind of goes to the discussion we had this morning of everybody talking past each other, right? So the goal of this particular program is to broaden the field. So this combines our business, law, and computer science schools. So students take core courses across all three of those disciplines and do applied capstone projects for real-world clients with this common language of risk management. Only launched a few years ago, but we got has a decent uptake so far, 100% placement rate. It helps to be in a field with negative unemployment for sure. But that's been a lot of fun. And that, I should say, is in Bloomington, another thread to this morning. Way better than Gloomington, huh? Yeah, it's Lafayette, if there's any info that. That's where Purdue is. I'm kidding. So if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. The other hat that I wear is director of this thing called the Ostrom Workshop. Has anybody heard of Eleanor Ostrom out there? Any other governance nerds or econ people? So Eleanor Ostrom is famous in certain circles. She's the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics 10 years ago. In fact, on Monday, we're dedicating a historical marker at IU because we're commemorating this 10-year anniversary. And she won the Nobel Prize in part for challenging conventional wisdom, like the tragedy of the commons idea, right? And we're applying some of her same ideas, including what we're talking about today, around polycentric governance. How do you get lots of different groups at lots of different levels, plenty of stakeholders working well together around a common problem? She was focused toward the end of her career on climate change, and we're applying some of those same insights now to cybersecurity, internet governance, and we even now have a cyber peace working group that stood up there. with academics all over the world and practitioners. So if you're interested in that, you can just, it's linked. I'm happy to send out the slides, or we can, or feel free just to do a search for Oshram Workshop and cyber, and you can get on our list. There's cyber peace, blockchain governance, IoT, whole range of things, including an upcoming conference, a cyber peace workshop that we're doing with NYU next month in New York. So I'll say more about that at the end too. So if you wouldn't mind, go to the next slide. What the heck is cyber peace? That's always a good first starting point, right? There's not one definition. I got interested in this back in 2013. I was researching a book about cybersecurity, and I was just kind of getting, frankly, a bit down, because back then all the books were cyber war, conflict, right? So at the time I was doing a visiting thing at Notre Dame, and I was interested in flipping the paradigm, right? What's the best we can hope for in terms of peace on the internet? Not the end of cyber attacks, a more negative cyber peace, which I think we can all agree is incredibly unlikely, especially in the near term. But, you know, what's a more positive vision? Very few efforts were made to that point. This is the Vatican's approach you see on the screen up there. It's even better in Latin, pretty long. You know, to simplify from that, there's kind of three core concepts, right? So one, have a system where we respect human rights, and we can debate what that includes, right to privacy, maybe even a right to cybersecurity, right? Spreads internet access along with cybersecurity best practices, so kind of rights and responsibilities there, and strengthens multi-stakeholder governance mechanisms, right? So that's a starting point, but there's been lots of different visions of this over the years. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, that'd be great. Here's kind of where we're at now. I have a book coming out this next year. It's going to be quite, it might be out by December. It'll be, I'm sure, a huge stocking stuffer. It's about this thick. But it's looking at cyber peace. And a much more accessible one is also coming out on IoT, if there's any folks interested in that. But basically, we're trying to take a really multidisciplinary approach here to figure out best practices from a lot of different contexts, including peacekeeping. So this focus of the workshop with NYU is getting lessons from all kinds of analogies, peacekeeping, even sustainable development, like we heard about this morning, and I'll say a little bit more about that as well. There's a couple of other, you know, more specific efforts you see up there. Some are sector specific, so we've done some work looking at sectors like telecom, sports, a lot of stuff on insurance, trade and investment treaties, and, you know, some more specific ideas, like you see down there, there was a op-ed I did a few months ago for the Wall Street Journal on whether we need a national cybersecurity safety board modeled after the NTSB, along with a lot of other stuff, including a cyber peace corps, which has been, you know, launching in stages around the world, and we have a new clinic that's going to be plugged into that effort. If you wouldn't mind, the next slide. So a lot of different approaches to this. One idea you see sometimes, anybody heard of this before? FDR's four freedom speech? Yeah, exactly, right? So it's still relatively famous. So one idea to think about this, and this isn't unique, of course, you know, to me, a lot of folks, Hillary Clinton among others, has talked about different freedoms in cyberspace. But if you think about it in that context, these are some of the ideas that pop up, but they're operationalized in lots of different ways. You might have heard of the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace. They came out. There you go. You know, late last year. And, you know, they have 7 principles. A lot of disinformation, election security. There were norms against private sector hackback, lots of stuff like that. So there's very different approaches. So part of the first step here is figuring out, you know, what are the core kind of low-hanging fruit issues that we can all agree on and build out from there. If you wouldn't mind, the next slide would be great. Lots of different cooks in the kitchen, of course, as always. Think about that polycentric structure we talked about. So the UN, of course, has the ongoing group of government experts, among others, lots of different think tanks getting interested as well. There's a good piece on cyber peace from the Atlantic Council I'd recommend. Companies, of course, there's by no means an exclusive list there. There's lots of them behind these efforts, including the recently announced Cyber Peace Institute that has some funding from Microsoft, MasterCard, right, among others. That's going to be an interesting partner, and they're coming to the Cyber Peace Workshop for what it's worth. Lots of different foundations, including this one, among others. Academia, there's different hotspots around the country. You know, Berkeley, for sure, with their Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. Clearly not Purdue, I'm kidding. MIT, you know, Harvard, Tufts has a new program. There's a lot of good ones out there. Lots of different organizations. And as you see up there, a laundry list of initiatives, some quite broad, like the Paris Call, and some more specific, like the Christchurch Call, that was designed to respond to disinformation and the spread of terrorist content through social media platforms. So if you wouldn't mind doing the next slide. So there's no easy way to conceptualize how all these groups are or are not working together. This is an effort by Joe Nye, who used to be the dean of the Kennedy School at Harvard. And this is his effort to kind of map it out, right? There's a lot of different acronyms there. It's a whole alphabet soup. But that is also a strength. There's a whole ecosystem that we can draw from as a community. The trick is, how can we do that, effectively to actually make some progress and not just have, yet another plenary session. If you wouldn't mind going to the next one, that'd be great. So there's different ways to think about that. One is there's an effort to think about clubs, all right? So there was a recent, book that's coming out with Richard Clark and Robert Nackey, some of you folks might have heard of, and they actually argue for an Internet Freedom League. Have you guys heard about this? They just had a piece in Foreign Affairs about it. They're basically arguing for starting the process of decoupling from a more authoritarian vision of cyberspace, with the idea that data flows will be more free and there'll be more incentives to come along to this kind of more freedom-centric vision of kind of the classic 90s version of cyberspace, right? Pushing back against that are lots of other ideas, right? And so one way that we're trying to get at this is by starting with really grassroots stuff, starting with this clinic that I mentioned. We got funding from the Hewlett Foundation and the Indiana Economic Development Corporation to launch this thing in the spring. The focus is on local critical infrastructure protection. So we're working a lot with local governments, school corporations, utilities, things like that. You see a list of some of our former clients. We just had a great project with Consumer Reports. They have a digital standard that they've stood up to start to rank products and services in terms of their privacy and security. So that's a great NGO that's making a lot of difference. So that will be ongoing, and we're looking for partners. So if anybody's interested, the idea is we'll be making all this freely accessible, webinars, guides. There's a coalition of others, including at UT Austin, I'm sorry to say, and at Berkeley that are doing similar stuff. So we'll be working with them too. Would welcome others. Next slide. We're almost there. Analogies, of course, are really important. We talked about peacekeeping a little bit. We did a whole conference on sustainable development and cybersecurity about a year and a half ago. We've done a couple of pieces on this. I did one called Sustainable Cybersecurity. I think that was 2017. And we frankly think, I completely agree with this wonderful speaker this morning. There's a lot to figure out there. There's a lot that we can leverage. There's some tools, all right, like different certification schemes, integrated reporting, as was mentioned, that can be utilized. Already some companies like Eli Lilly, which is a little pharma company you might have heard of in Indianapolis, they're using their integrated reports to talk about privacy and cybersecurity already, right? And there's lots of different environmental law concepts, like common but differentiated responsibilities, that we can apply to this too. So we have an ongoing work stream on that. And I think last but not least, of course, the rise of IoT, right? My God. So this is all getting more complicated, and that's where we're taking this research for sure in a big way next year. And I'd love to hear different thoughts on how to, approach governance, how to approach cyber peace in a world where everything, including our bodies even, wind up being connected. So those bright lines between cyber and reality are quickly blurred. And last but not least, I believe, there you go, there's me. And there's a flyer for the workshop that I mentioned with NYU. We're also co-sponsoring it with a few different universities from Paris. It's gonna be a lot of fun. There's a public event that Thursday night, day-long event that Friday, and you can stream into bits of it too. And we'll have a follow-up of it in Bloomington next spring. So it's a chance to get in on the ground floor. There'll be a cyber peace white paper coming out of this, and a really interesting eclectic group, Red Cross, lots of different groups will be there as well. So. Okay. Thank you so much.
So great. Now you got this crash course from the expert. I think we and you know that how much help this whole space needs. Probably move on to Bob and tap into his experience of working, around the world now on several topics. Then we'll go to Tony.
Thanks very much, Val. I'm a co-founder in a company called RIWI. It stands for Real-Time Interactive Worldwide Intelligence. What we are is we're a sentiment analysis company, a data collection company. We can ask any question of a random sample of internet users in any country in the world. Any country except North Korea. So we fall into the top left corner of the cyber peace quadrant, the freedom of speech, the free flow of information. And what we have found in our work for various NGOs, including the UN and the World Bank and Greenpeace, that there's a lot less division between countries and within countries than the leaders might make it seem to be. For example, You might have, this wasn't our work, but it's relevant here in the United States, particularly at this time when this apparent great division. I'm from Canada, so I'm speaking as a neutral here. I see division between the leaders, but there was a very interesting study of people of both parties asking on divisive questions what the people of the other party thought. And they each thought that the other people were more radical than they actually were, showing that people are more aligned than their leaders might seem to be. And this is what we see internationally as well. We've done some work, for example, in Israel. There's a lot of belief led by leaders in the Middle East, Arab countries, that there isn't support among their population for Israel. However, the data that we did, and it was done for the country of Israel, it was released by the Prime Minister, and it showed that there was a strong amount of support for Israel among the average person. In UAE, the support was 30%, 42%. In Saudi Arabia, it was 30%. Overall, you had a majority, 50% in Middle Eastern countries, stating that Israel was a power or an asset, so a positive view of Israel. We've also done work for the World Bank, and while the result is not surprising if you think about it, it is interesting to see actual data. We surveyed 10,000 people in 15 different countries, some who are Western countries where there's great peace, and other countries like Syria and Congo and Nigeria where there's great conflict. We asked them, are they optimistic for the future? In the peaceful countries, they were not optimistic for the future, whereas in the post-conflict countries, they were. So getting this ground truth data can be very helpful in understanding the future of peace. Likewise, last data I'll present is the work we did in Iraq. In Iraq, we asked 4,000 people 2 questions and we asked them about what has transformed in their life over the last 18 years. This was work we did last year. We asked them, what have they lost over the last 18 years? The 2 main responses is hope for our children, 21% had lost that, and they had lost personal integrity, 18%. The second question we asked, in the peace building, the restoration and pacification of the country, what was lacking in the last 18 years? Their responses, top 2 responses, were jobs and youth involvement.
So you can think about how these are sentiments that could be tapped into if we want to talk from, change the conversation from cyber crime, cyber threat, cyber war, cyber terrorism to cyber peace. And that brings us to Tony. Last but not the least, you're doing an amazing amount of intense work with a certain program. So, Tony, take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Val, and I just want to thank you for having me. This is fantastic to see everyone here. Yeah, I'm probably a person with very little skin in this game. I've been a CISO probably since the late 90s, and I'm still recovering. I'm now a CIO at Urban One, an entertainment company, so having worked in banking and manufacturing most of my career all over the world, it's quite refreshing. Although when you think about the challenges on the planet as it relates to cyber peace, it really touches a lot of what I do in some of my side gigs. So I'm on the board of directors of Blue Cross Blue Shield, the board of directors of a publicly traded bank in New York, and I've been on the board of the National Security Agency at Fort Meade since 2006 through pretty much 4 administrations. So when you see this challenge evolving, whether it's cyber peace, the things that I think of are freedom of democracy, and freedom of the internet. And if you guys are familiar with the Freedom House initiatives, very closely related to things that I hold dear. When I think of cyber peace, I also worry very much about our social constructs, especially as you think about agency operations and nation state operations, right? Is if we evolve without cyber peace and come to a point in our lives where our children, as well as ourselves, we don't know what the truth is, and pause on that for a minute. That's happening right now, right? It's the truth is being challenged, through constructs of social media and agency operations by various countries all over the world. And we've seen which ones those are. I think there's ones that are very, very good at it. Iran, China, North Korea are brilliant at inciting challenges all over our planet, right? And it's not just the US, right? Val alluded to some work I'm doing, and again, I have no horse in this race. It's, just being a US patriot. There's a act supported by Senator Gardner from Colorado called ARIA, the Asia Reinsurance Act. And it's really to help spawn democracy, freedom, and especially freedom of the internet in the Asia Pacific region, right? Because you can understand probably the asymmetric challenges that many of these countries have vis-a-vis China. It's almost staggering, right? In terms of the challenges they have with promoting, freedom of the internet, use of the internet, getting information that is true. All of those challenges, I think, are things we have to think about when it comes to cyber peace. It's not necessarily just war versus peace, but it has a lot to do with freedom, right? And what we can do as cyber practitioners and cyber leaders to help make sure, how are we incenting freedom around the internet and getting to the truth? How are we providing safeguards and certainly applying a level playing field so that, our children who are going to grow up in a very different world than at least I grew up with don't have to, when they go to get the news or social information. I can't imagine, being in high school right now and trying to understand what's fact and what's fiction. I don't know if you guys have a solution for this. I mean, I know I don't.
Wikipedia.
Yeah. Well, it must be. Since China makes great donations to Wikipedia, I'm sure all of that stuff is correct. So fire away. I think that really is where, I think about the challenges is, all countries have not been created equal, especially, when you think about things like freedom of the internet, and, you can open up any paper and read about Hong Kong. And if you really read about Hong Kong, you're going to find out there's been, hundreds of thousands of agency operations coming out of China that is distorting all of the truth, right? And the news flow into mainland versus Hong Kong is staggeringly different, and you wonder why, right? Well, it's that there really is no constructs around ensuring you're getting the truth. So when you think of things like Cyber Peace Corps or, doing good for cyber, these are the things that we have to help promote. So those are my comments.
So,
If I could just
absolutely, go ahead.
follow on China. Absolutely, they've got the great firewall of China on information and cybersecurity. But some information from Hong Kong, according to our data, is the riots and protests in Hong Kong is leaking through to the average Chinese. We've been surveying constantly over the last couple months since the protests started on consumer confidence. That's been the proxy question. We don't want to directly ask people in China what they think of the protests in Hong Kong. The proxy question is consumer confidence. What do they think is going to happen to prices? And we've seen since the protests have become more and more significant that people think prices are going to rise more. So that's our view.
Thank you. So I think, in terms of taking the steps forward and Scott, you represent a community that's, I think, underrepresented in many different ways. It's not clearly defined. I think probably another 3 to 5 years before we can actually have a coherent way, and then we want to fast track that, right? There's no, you cannot chill here. It's a serious and immediate issue. What do you think the cyber peace concept needs in terms of arms and legs to stand up and run in this community?
I think clarity would be good. It can't be all things to all people. I mean, we think about peace. It's not even peace in the quote unquote real world. It's not the absence of conflict, right? But it's a more sustainable, peaceful existence. One that we can at least make it comparable to other business and national security risks. Like one that we have a tool set to deal with. So from where I sit, going through this really tough process of defining, what are the core elements that we believe in here? Freedom to use, to access cyberspace, to organize. That could be a big piece of it. Maybe other low-hanging fruit like protecting critical infrastructure. We got to agree on what that is. That's in the eye of the beholder quite often. Even countries as similar as the EU and the U.S. or regions don't see eye to eye on that, right? So I think that's the difficult process that needs to happen to decide, all right, what do we need to start with? What are the core norms to start making progress on this? But I think even just having a goal, even a medium-term goal in mind is helpful, because so quickly this can degenerate into so bifurcated discussions about this problem around disinformation or that problem around ransomware, whatever it might be. But by having, some vision, some finish line, even if we never quite get there, I think that can be an animating influence and help to, get a lot of people, especially young people, kind of motivated to make a difference.
Yeah.
As far as a very long-term goal and pie in the sky, it's been tried before by many people over many years, but a long-term vision goal could be, and Tony, perhaps you or Scott know more about this, would be a international cyber treaty.
Yeah. So Tony, I have a specific question for you. You do a phenomenal job in terms of economic upliftment or serving underprivileged kids, and we were together in your home, and then I should tell you, when Tony opened up his door to a incredible organization and collective people community which is helping underprivileged kids, and we have a next session probably will cover that. But what do you think the economic incentives have to play here so that we kind of nip in the bud and we have more progress, I would say more positive approach towards getting cyber discussion towards a more, economically enabling, giving opportunities in career as well as growth, right, in those underprivileged areas. And that's probably more over in overseas, other people who don't have those opportunities. What do you think of the economic angle for cyber peace?
Yeah, as you think about that, I think there's, certainly we know there's a challenging negative unemployment problem, not only in the U.S., but globally around cyber. And certainly, I think what we have to do, and thanks for alluding to diverse by design, I'm also on the board of directors of Perscalis. And Perscalis, basically what they do is they take 18 to 28-year-olds in overlooked communities and help companies build talent pipelines of diverse individuals in cyber and technology roles. And Val was just at our dinner last week with great sponsorship, and we raised a tremendous amount of money to do this. We have to think, I think, a lot differently in the U.S. I think in some ways we're tremendously behind in terms of the vocation of cybersecurity. And this is where I think in the U.S. we have it so backwards, it's actually staggering, is that if you went up to someone and said, I'm going to vocational school, it was as if you told them they were going to detention center, right? And if you were in Europe and you said, I'm going to vocational school and I'm going to be a cyber practitioner, people would think you're brilliant, right? I mean, that's just the truth. And I see everyone laughing and the heads going up and down. My son comes home and says, hey, Dad, I'm going to vocational school. If this was, if I said this to my father, he'd think, well, you're going to go be a mechanic or a welder, right? I mean, this is such a failing in the U.S. It's almost stunning, is that we believe we have to have 4-year degrees, no offense, Scott, to do, to be great at cyber, right? Yeah, I like that. But I think, Val, as you think about it, companies like Europe, companies like Perspalis, and, us thinking differently about what it means to be at least entry into the cybersecurity community is one place that all of us should stand up and do something about, especially this vocational challenge that we have in the United States. I think outside the U.S., I think there's just a call for opportunity. One of the things I think we've done well in the U.S. is, in many cases, be very, very technical in the way we think about cyber, and maybe overtly so, whereas in other parts of the planet I've been to, it's been a heavily focused area of governance. And if we could get somewhat of a blend across the board, where we're teaching both the governance and thoughtful approaches to that, as well as the technical acumen, and then let people self-select on where they want to go in those things, I think we're going to be much better off, not only as a nation, but as a planet. And that's where I'm a big advocate in thinking about how we can build, vocational schools, vocational programs, and have people choose this, and another word that we're not supposed to say, apprenticeship in cyber. But why doesn't anybody say these things, right? Is it really that bad of a word in the United States to say vocational school and apprenticeship? We've got to get over that, because that's the only way we're going to fix the cyber problem in the U.S. and where we can learn in Europe.
So I think the next probably logical angle, as I can think of this, tying this conversation together, is that the cybersecurity industry has been primarily technical, and now we got technology people here, policy people here, lawyers and everyone. I mean, typically cyber pieces have been more on the policy wonk side. You have to be really policy wonk to understand what those regulations and all mean. Where do you see this journey in the next, at least in the foreseeable future, maybe, a year or 2 years, where the norms, principles, before they become laws, are a little bit clearer defined, that they can be kind of put in a construct of cyber peace framework, a framework approach to cyber peace. What's your thought on that, Scott?
Yeah, I think we're seeing some early steps in that direction, certainly. So if folks aren't familiar, the Carnegie Endowment, for example, has a nice international cyber norms database where you can go and you can see the sets of countries and organizations that sign on to different norms. There's other relevant efforts like the ITU's Global Cybersecurity Index. So I think the first idea is just to make it more transparent about what's happening. There's a lot of aspects to that, VEP, you name it, but at least what's happening. And then to start the process of having, countries, but also companies, talk about what their codes of conduct should be at the organizational level. And that's where I think more CSR comes into play as well. And also nations, right? And that process is happening at the UN right now, where for the first time countries are going on the record and talking about how international law should apply to cyber attacks, right? That's a big deal, could potentially be a big deal, and to clarify this stuff going forward. But I think there has to be pressure from the community. This is a very influential, and broad community, as you said, Val. So one thing we're trying to do is, for example, late November, one thing we're doing at this workshop is to formally launch the Cyber Peace Alliance, which is going to be an alliance of private sector groups, civil society, academia. There's some UN agencies involved in that as well, to try to start to push, right? To push for certain goals that we think are very attainable, that are frankly not that controversial, at least in most quarters, and to start to make some progress. So then a few years from now, maybe we could realize some form of digital Geneva Convention of the kind.
That's great. So what do the sentiments talk about? How can we achieve that? I mean, in terms of sentiments, Rigby does all the sentiment analysis. Do you have any trend or how this would be taken?
Well, I mean, we could do the sentiments. That would be an excellent suggestion and idea, is ask people from country to country. We can do every country in the world. What do they think the norms should be? How do they think their government should be acting?
Yeah, absolutely. And Tony, to kind of wrap this up, this session, what are your thoughts of what's not happening? I mean, what should we do in addition to, like, there is a cyber piece on a policy side in one extreme, and then there is cybersecurity mostly on the technical and risk side. Where do you think we can bridge the gap?
That's a tough question. I think the challenge is with cyber peace, and look, I think it's a great foundation, and there's, significant opportunity. The problem is that the incentives to do harm are higher right now than the incentives to do good in cyber. And, you know, I hate always telling the truth, but it's just being honest. You know, I would say there's probably certainly close to, you know, half of the countries that would rather see the ability for them to, you know, obstruct justice, prevent freedoms, steal intellectual property, rather than focus on how do we get harmony, right? And that's just the, you know, the elephant in the room. And I think that's the thing we have to work with, is we have to work with those that want to form the coalition, right? And build that coalition of cyber peace capability to hopefully, you know, almost, you know, the Mark Twain paint the fence, right? Is once we get the coalition of the good being larger than the coalition of the challenging, I think you're going to pull those off one after the other. But I think, as both you guys would agree, it's one voice and one country at a time.
That's great. All right, I'll be mindful of the speaker's time here. So with this, thank you very